change my verification code from a phone verification code to a text verification code. We seem to be having a bit of difficulty getting you guys to do that. Well, I've been in that system many times, and I never was given an option of texting. Yeah, but it won't know that until it actually makes a call. So there's got to be some way for me when I log on to change it. It shows you that option, but it doesn't show me that option. Is that correct? Well, you see, that's the point. It doesn't show me. And I need to find a way to make that happen. So I can maybe somehow delete the phone number and try to re-enter it, maybe. Well, I get texts from everybody else, so there's no reason I can get texts from you. Okay. 106. your system apparently forces you to send the verification codes to the same email. And that's not actually a good strategy. So I was hoping that my verification codes could be sent to a different email. I think I got that done yesterday. And you're saying that's something wrong on my end? That I would hear it. Well, that's interesting because up till about a month ago, I had landlines, and I changed the number to a cell phone number. So I'm thinking that could be a legacy mistake. Not to a landline. See, I discontinued the landline and switched to a cell phone. Correct. Well, I need this to be straightened out because right now, if I receive a verification code by phone, you answer the phone and then it says, please enter the something, something, something. And it does, the something, something, something is completely unintelligible. I have no idea what they want me to enter. And in any case, I can't enter the system. No. I mean, they call you. You know, you guys, you actually have to do this yourselves, see what the problems are. If you receive a verification email, verification code by phone, you pick up your phone and it says to you, if you want your verification code, press the following. And then it says something, but the something is unintelligible. You cannot hear what you said or she said. And then if you press the right buttons, which I am unable to do, then it will read you your verification code. It doesn't, as soon as you pick up the phone, it doesn't give you your verification code. You got to jump through hoops first because you can't see the phone. But when you get the text, it's right there. There's no hoops to jump through. It is not as wonderful because I work in secure environments.
You want us to sit and then come up? Excellent. Do that.
I just got back from Central Asia, so I'm really I was thinking about it.
What I'd love to do is send a text.
Anyway, I would like to get on
Do it yourself.
We got a little bit of time.
You can send me a text. Then we need your system to do exactly what you want. Yeah, but don't you think that's a problem if it actually is a cell phone? And you are actually able to send me a text? That's not bad. Well, I'm not asking that you do this every single time. I'm asking you to prove to yourself that it is in fact a cell phone, that it does in fact walk around the office. And if that's true, then you gotta go to your tech people to say, hey, I sent the guy a text, he got it, it's obviously a cell phone, it obviously please fix the system. Well, that's the point. Tech people are there to fix systems, not to set them up for gossip and something. to get a hold of the engineering people. Even ask them. That does no good.
All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us today. The event, the Fait Accompli in 21st Century Security Landscape, from Crimea to Doklam to the Spratly Islands. And we'll be featuring Daniel Altman, who is a good friend of mine and also been thinking a lot about the issues of red lines and fait accomplis for quite a while. I think actually back when we were in class together in 2008, he had this project already developed, and he's been continuing to develop for the last 10 years. So I think despite his relative youth, he's been working hard on these research problems for quite a number of years, probably far longer than most of us. So in general, let me just give you a little plan for the afternoon. We're going to have Dan come up here and give a little talk and presentation. He's got a PowerPoint slide presentation. And then from there, we'll have two discussants. We'll take a seat at the table, and two discussants, Joshua Rovner and Olga Oliker, will provide some comments and feedback on the presentation and extrapolations for particular cases or scenarios. And then we'll just open up to Q&A and have a good discussion, and feel free to develop some questions, some tough questions for Dan. Let me just give you a little background on our speakers. So Dan Altman is an assistant professor of political science at Georgia State University, and he's developing a book manuscript called Red Lines in International Politics that explores how and why some red lines effectively constrain behavior while others do not. Highly pertinent today, obviously. Olga Oliker is a senior advisor and director of the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her recent research is focused on military and political, economic, and social development in countries in transition, particularly in Russia, but also Ukraine, Central Asia, and Caucasian successor states to the Soviet Union. And Joshua Rovner, who is new to town, relatively speaking, is an associate professor at the School of International Service at the American University. His research interests include intelligence, strategy, nuclear weapons, and U.S. defense policy. Josh is the author of Fixing the Facts, National Security and the Politics of Intelligence, and co-editor of the forthcoming volume Chaos in the Liberal Order, the Trump Presidency and International Politics in the 21st Century. So quite a star-studded lineup here today. Just a little anecdote about Dan before he gets started, because we have a couple minutes. So he's a very accomplished scholar already. You can take a look at his website, where he has, which was linked from the events page, where he has a number of his papers posted online, recent publications and forthcoming publications. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see he's got some applications of his theory for parenting. I don't believe Dan is a parent as of now, but I've decided to take the liberty of sort of reading his guidelines to parenting, particularly the strategic game of dessert. And I tried to apply it recently with my daughter. It didn't work out so well. But hopefully Dan's theories will have more success when it comes to explaining some other areas of the world. So with that, I'll leave it to Dan to take it away.
Thank you. That was actually a work of humor written on a dare from Amy Ziegard at CSAC. It's more comedy than anything else, but you can find that too on my website. All right. So I'm here today for one fairly simple purpose, which is I want to make the case that the fait accompli as a strategy, as a concept, and as a term deserves far more attention than I think it receives right now, both in Washington and in sort of IR academic circles around the world. To do that, I'm going to provide evidence that it's more common than you might think, that it's more relevant to the current cases we care about than you might think, and that it's become more important over time. But what I want to start with, rather than starting with a formal definition, is an analogy, right? And bear with me here, because what I want to do is not just make the case, like some little bits of existing literature have argued, this is a thing that happens from time to time and that can be important. I want to make the case that the fait accompli is one of the sort of fundamental modes of aggression or ways of making a gain call them challengers, let's use a less loaded term than revisionists or aggressors in international politics, right? And I think this analogy plays a role in explaining why, right? So what I want to sort of pose as a question is, suppose a criminal armed with a gun encounters a wealthy man holding his wallet, right? And the criminal wants to get the wallet. What can he do, right? And this is sort of an analogy to, say, a state that wants a piece of territory or some other goal, right? Well, the first thing you can do is just knock his water over. Get this out of the way. Shoot the man and take the wallet, right? The sort of most escalatory scenario, right? Another thing he can do is threaten to shoot, right? Demand the wallet and receive it as a concession, right? So if we put these up, this is Schelling's classic distinction in Arms and Influence, right? The whole first chapter of maybe the most influential book in the 20th century about strategy is about this distinction between brute force and coercion, right? And I think this distinction has structured how we think ever since. But what I'm going to argue is that there's a third basic option and a third thing that this criminal can do, which is just to reach out as he's pointing the gun with one hand, reach out with his other hand and snatch that wallet, right? And calculate that he has a good chance of getting away with it, and that the other guy, the victim, the wealthy man, won't come back at him and try to get it back, won't attack an armed man, right? And I'm going to call this the fait accompli, right? So you grab the wallet and you bet that the other side won't then escalate in response, right? So if we apply the same sort of way of thinking to Russia's operation to take Crimea and then formally annex it, shown here, right? You can see the same three options for Russia, right? Russia could have defeated the Ukrainian army in dictated terms, right? Big advantage in conventional power, nuclear power, right? This is maybe higher level of escalation than is appropriate for the limited goal in play, right? More likely, and right, if Vladimir Putin had been sort of taking IR 101 or reading the IR playbook, this is probably what he should have done, is he should have used coercion, right? We talked endlessly about coercion. He could have issued an ultimatum, demanded Crimea, mobilized his forces, moved them up to the front lines, amassed a superior force, right, and given sort of a deadline by which Ukraine had to agree to relinquish it or else, right? All of that is a perfectly plausible thing that Russia could have done, but it's not what Russia actually did. And what I'll argue is that it's not what countries in the position of Russia usually do, right? And so the third thing, and what Russia actually, of course, did, is simply take Crimea, right, using the green men, a point I'll return to, and bet that Ukraine, and by extension NATO, wouldn't attack them, a bet that turned out to be right. So if you want to think about sort of, if you don't like hypothetical examples and you want to think about real examples of these historically that were important in their period, you can think about Iraq's invasion of Kuwait as an example of brute force, right? They weren't trying to get Kuwait to bow to their will politically. They weren't trying to take some small piece of something. They were just wiping out the Kuwaiti military and taking over everything, right? Brute force. This led to the Gulf War, where they were ejected by the US-led coalition, of course, right? If we go to the Munich crisis, very famous, historically important case of coercion in the run-up to World War II, right? This is the infamous appeasement of Hitler, right? Where Hitler mobilizes forces, issues threats, intimidates the British and the French into backing off their support for Czechoslovakia, which forced Czechoslovakia into conceding the Sudetenland as a concession, right? He doesn't take it by force, he takes it after they agree, so he has permission, however reluctant, right, or Crimea as the fait accompli. So the question I'm going to ask and prevent sort of numbers on is how common are each of these, right? These are three different ways of getting something for a challenger, right? Three different modes of aggression, if you want to use that language in international politics. How common are each of these? And the answer might surprise you. But before I get there, what I want to do is just actually define the fait accompli now that I've sort of introduced it and given some examples. Right, so I'm going to define it as imposing a limited gain without permission in an attempt to induce the adversary to relent rather than escalate in response. Right, so it's sort of a calculated gamble that you can get away with taking something. I try to avoid the word take in the definition just because there are cases like the Soviet fait accompli of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. They're not taking the missiles, right? They're imposing them. They're putting them there. Right, the word take is not always appropriate, so I use the word impose in the definition, but usually like taking land is the common example I'll come back to time and again. Right, so two of its sort of core defining characteristics: gains are taken, not received as concessions. Right here, it's similar to brute force. Right, it almost looks like smaller or less escalatory brute force, but very different from coercion, which is about inducing the other side to agree to give something up. You never have to do that with a fait accompli. You just take it. Right, suddenly it's gone from their perspective. And second, and here's where it's very different from brute force, whereas in brute force, you're starting a war, planning to win it, and then get what you want, which is usually something big. With the fait accompli, you start by taking something small, and you hope to avoid the war altogether, right? So you're not trying to win the war, you're trying to avoid it. This is going to require you to limit your aims to something you can get away with taking, right? You can't generally go for everything and expect to get away with it. Why wouldn't they fight for everything? So you go for something much smaller, something more limited. You're not destroying or disabling the adversary, right? You're making a strategic calculation that they won't choose to counterattack. And then this is a calculated risk, right? So most of the time, we might think this works, but some of the time you're going to miscalculate, right? You're going to take more than they're willing to part with, like Pakistan did in Kargil in '99, like the Argentina did in the Falklands in 1982, and then you're going to start a war, potentially a war, as in both those cases, that's not going to go well for you. Right, two of its more interesting characteristics, and maybe two reasons why we might expect it to be a somewhat appealing strategy. One is that if we compare it to coercion, and usually when I'm using the term coercion, I'm referencing Schelling's idea of compellence, if that isn't clear. For those of you who are familiar with those distinctions, if not, don't worry about it. But basically for compellence, right, if you're pointing a gun at someone and saying, give me this thing or else, right, give me this piece of land or else, if you're Russia, they have to believe it or else they're not going to give it to you, right? That's not, the same is not true for a fait accompli, right? You don't have to do all these different forms of signaling to get your sort of level of perceived resolve high enough that they'll hand something over. You just suddenly take it, right? And they didn't need to believe in advance or be convinced in advance that you were going to do it because you've already done it. Right? And it doesn't mean that credibility isn't important at all. There's several ways in which it still is important, but this is one big way in which credibility and signaling usually matter, in which they're taken out of the story. And I think that's important because signaling is hard, and gaining a perception of credibility is hard. And if you can avoid it, that's to your benefit. Right? You never actually have to create this moment where they actually consciously agree to give you what you want, right? Actively hand it over and participate in that. You avoid that with the fait accompli. Right, and then the other aspect of it is that it lets you exploit the element of surprise, right? If you say, we're coming in to take this territory in a week, if you don't agree to give it up, right, they're probably going to reinforce their troops, or they might even hit you with a preemptive attack. But if you just take it suddenly, you get that advantage. Right, so turning to the question of, okay, how common are each of these three strategies? Now that hopefully we understand a little more clearly what a fait accompli is. Right. So the way I'm going to operationalize these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at territorial gains, right? And these aren't the only kind of gains that are important, right? And these are sort of big ticket gains, even though some of these are pretty small pieces of territory. But still, when land actually changes hands, that's a big deal in international politics. That's what most wars are fought about. Right, but it's nice because it's so important. It's nice because it's the most common issue that states dispute. It's also nice because it's, you know, your military controlled the piece of land one day, theirs controls it the next day. It's a pretty objective way to evaluate gains and losses, whereas some other issue areas are a little fuzzier. Right, so I'm going to use this as an issue area, and I'm going to use data I've collected on how territory has changed hands over the last 100 years all over the world. Right, most of this, it started as what I call the land grabs data set to operationalize the fait accompli. It's now grown into what I call the modern conquest data set, which is the most comprehensive data on territorial conquest over the last 100 years. So that's where most of this is coming from. I also created a list of cases of coercion acquiring territory. This started from Sexer's militarized compellant threats data set and his definition of coercion. I then supplemented that from some other sources, found a few other cases. I can go into that more in the Q&A if you're interested. So the question I want to ask, right, we have these three sort of models, right, brute force, these are your Kuwaits, coercion, these are your Sudeten lands, fait accompli, these are your Crimeas. The question I want to ask is how common do you think each of these are? And then I'll put up the numbers. And just think about that for a second, because how much do we talk about each of these in the literature, right? We don't always use the term brute force, but these are sort of fighting the big wars, right? We talk about this all the time in one form or another. And we talk about coercion all the time. But we don't talk about the fait accompli that much. In fact, until the last year, there wasn't anything that I'm aware of peer-reviewed with that as the primary topic or in the title. Probably the longest treatment was a few pages deep in George and Smoke's tome on deterrence. As sort of one niche form of deterrence failure with kind of weird characteristics. Right? This idea that it's a thing that happens from time to time, that gets mentioned here and there, but isn't some fundamental part of international politics. But here, and this really did surprise me, here's what I found, is that it looked like this. Right? It's not even close. There's just far fewer cases of coercion actually acquiring territory than I ever would have expected. And these small little grabs where you go in and take a relatively small piece of territory are much, much more common than I sort of necessarily understood, right? They account for the clear majority of territorial gains, right? And this sort of raises questions about why, if this tactic is so common, and why do we see so much more attention paid to the others, right? With brute force, it kind of makes sense, right? These cases, yes, they're individually less common, but they're individually much more important, right? Okay, that's reasonable. With coercion, though, these tend to be small territories, too, for the most part. Sort of the question I'm going to pose is, why do we talk so much about coercion and talk so much less about the fait accompli, and do we have that backwards? Let me just address a few sort of more methodological points. First of all, could this look different in other issue areas? Absolutely. I think it does change a lot based on the issue area. I think there are some issue areas that are more favorable to coercion. There are even some issue areas where the fait accompli doesn't work. Think about Israel's attempts to get Arab states to recognize it diplomatically. You can't impose that, right? They have to give it to you. There are other issue areas that work the other way, though, and that are, if anything, even more favorable to the fait accompli. So we can go into that in the Q&A. There are also, remember, I'm operationalizing the fait accompli as sort of relatively small seizures of some piece of territory, right? You could wonder sort of other things going on there. I'll come back to that on the next slide. And then you could sort of wonder, well, have I stacked the deck? Because I'm looking at territorial acquisitions, but maybe the fait accompli, right? You take a territory and then they take it right back, or it starts a war and you lose the war, and maybe I'm only including basically successful coercion, but I'm including sort of both successes and failures of these other strategies. But actually, if you look 10 years out, yes, about half the fait accomplis don't have the state that seized the territory doesn't have it 10 years later. But that's also true for the coerced cessions. That's also true for brute force. It's actually a little less than half for brute force because the Axis lost World War II. Right? If we look, this is on the distinction between brute force and the fait accompli. So this is a very crude way of looking at the size of seized territories all over the world over the last 100 years. What you see is, I think, evidence that there really are sort of two strategies of conquest, right? You basically either go for a small piece and try to get away with it without fighting, or you go for the whole thing. You accept that they're going to fight, and then why limit your aims, right? So brute force and the fait accompli, right? So part of a province to a province accounts for the big chunk of cases. There's not a lot, right? Going for half of a country, a quarter of a country, 3/4 of a country, it's not completely unprecedented, but it's quite rare. I think to a striking extent that reflects sort of underlying strategic dynamics. There are a few cases. Now, some of these are smaller than they look because I had to fold like small parts of 3 provinces is still in 3, small parts of 4. So there are actually a lot of those cases in the middle. What few there are smaller, much smaller than they look. But there are a few there that are probably better regarded as limited wars. Come back to those if you want. But even if that's 10 to 15 cases, 10 to 15 cases isn't going to change the underlying dynamic. Basically, there are a lot of ways you can slice and dice this comparison. Some of them will bring these numbers a little closer. None of them are going to change the fact that this is the most common way states make territorial gains, and yet we hardly ever talk about it. But the real point I want to build to is not about brute force. It's this simple fact. So I ran a very crude sort of back-of-the-envelope keyword search for coercion and for fait accompli in foreign affairs, and then major academic journals, International Organization, International Security, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Conflict Resolution and Security Studies, right? You can see just how much more common in all of these coercion is than the fait accompli, right? And then you can actually see how often territorial gains are made each way on the other side. And I think this, especially, the inclusion of foreign affairs gets to this. I think this is, to some extent, representative of the policy discourse as well, not just the academic discourse. What does this look like? Well, here's an example. This is a recent CSIS study, and I picked this not in the interest of criticizing it or because I think it's flawed, but because I think it's a particularly thorough and extensive study, a credible study, but yet it's still an example of the point I'm trying to make, which is that we end up stretching the concept of coercion beyond things that are necessarily what I would think of as coercion, and we end up, and this study does, to its credit, talk about the fait accompli a little bit in certain places, but from my perspective, the main issue at stake in, say, the South China Sea is the history of the fait accompli and the potential for future fait accompli, right? So we asked simple questions like, how did each side reach their current positions? It's not one side, China, Vietnam, the Philippines demanded that the others recognize their claims to some subset of the islands, and then they were granted control of them. They just went in and took them, right? And then others went in and took other islands. China took the Paracel Islands in '74 from South Vietnam. Different countries moved in over later years, for the most part, to the Spratly Islands, right? This was a bunch of unilateral, sudden seizures, right? That's very normal, and it's not. It's to me, it's straining the concept of coercion to call that coercion. There's no threats may be being made, but they're not being granted. There's no concessions, right? This is just a unilateral seizure over and over again, right? How well have purely verbal demands and threats worked? Just think about, China regularly protests U.S. freedom of navigation operations, says they're not permitted under international law. The United States criticizes sort of China's presence in certain islands and their building up, enlargement, land reclamation in certain islands. But none of these sort of verbal demands really work very well. Whether they're true coercion, I'll leave to sort of you to decide. I would suggest that if they're not, it's because the states involved know that more sort of clear-cut, unambiguous red lines also wouldn't work, and so just don't make them at all. And the broader question I want to ask is coercion truly the best analytical lens here? Right, I think what ends up happening is we just don't have a good word that is kind of the analog of military strategy for strategy short of war, right? Call it the gray zone recently, call it crisis strategy, I sometimes call it. No one else uses that term. It's not very good. But we don't have a good strategy for sort of before military strategy. And we end up calling it often coercive strategy, right? That just becomes this stand-in for strategy short of war, but that smuggles in all these assumptions about how important threat making is and concessions under threat are that I don't think are backed by the evidence. And actually, I think making threats works a lot less than we might think and is maybe a less important part of crises and other sort of strategic interactions on the brink of war than we've currently assumed. Right, if we look at land reclamation as a specific example, is it coercion? Again, I don't know what threats being made or demand is being made. Right? This just looks to me like a clear-cut fait accompli. And here's the part that's maybe more policy relevant, is then you have to ask, well, okay, so that's on the Chinese side, but if you're Vietnam or the Philippines or the United States, right, can you stop land reclamation with a fait accompli? It's very hard, right? I mean, you could take the islands, but that's very risky, very escalatory. You could attack the ships doing it, but again, right, either way, you're firing the first shot, right? You're invading current Chinese holdings, attacking them, right? And so I think there's two ways you can approach this issue based on whether you're thinking in terms of coercion or thinking in terms of the fait accompli. If you approach this as a classic sort of balance of resolve contest where each side sort of sends their signals and the side that has the sort of more resolve out-coerces the other, then all these sorts of little games the U.S. plays with freedom of navigation operations are much more important. But if you just look at it as who has the better sort of fait accompli card to play, right? China has a nonviolent card to get what it wants here that doesn't require attacking anybody, doesn't require taking new land, right? No crossing of major red lines. Whereas the U.S. or its allies, friends and allies, would have to violently attack either the islands or the Chinese ships, right? One of these fait accompli cards is just much better than the other, and it's sort of, from there, not surprising that China would be able, that basically deterrence here is going to be almost impossible. And I've honestly been surprised at the extent to which that isn't more or less taken for granted in policy debates, that deterrence of land reclamation, right? Criticizing it, imposing sort of slap on the wrist minor sanctions is one thing, but actually trying to deter it, it's hard for me to understand why that would be possible. Right? If you want a sort of a specific example, and this was widely criticized at the time, of sort of too much coercion thinking, not enough fait accompli thinking, right? We're going to have to send China a clear signal that first, the island building stops, and second, your access to these islands is not going to be allowed. In a world where everything is sort of determined by the mythical sort of balance of resolve and coercive credibility and leverage, this might seem plausible. But when you actually focus on the real sort of unilateral options each side have, when you start from the premise that it's very difficult to actually just sort of point a gun at someone and get them to do what you want, and it's more about what you can take without starting a war, what you think you can get away with taking, right? It becomes pretty clear why this isn't going to work. At least not without risks the United States isn't willing to run. If we think about Doklam, right, again, I think we see the primacy of the fait accompli as a tactic, right, in this sort of recent border showdown, ostensibly between Bhutan and China, but really between India, primarily between India and China, right? So the first move, especially from an Indian perspective, is fait accompli of Chinese road construction into this disputed territory, sort of building up their ability to access it, right? Again, I don't see how building a road would be a coercive threat, although I suppose you could interpret it as being in service of one, right? It seems to be a pretty simple case of fait accompli, right? Improves its strategic position, advances a territorial claim. India's move, the really sort of big move of the crisis from my perspective, right, is their troop deployment. And you could interpret it, I think it's an interesting question actually. You could interpret this as coercion, right, and as a signal of resolve, right, to try to get China to back down from building the road. So you prove that you're willing to do this, right? It's brinksmanship to an extent. That's plausible, but I'm more inclined to interpret it differently. And as a fait accompli, in part to reinforce Bhutan's claim, but more to the point to block China's progress, right, to actually sort of get in their way, right? And I think that matters for how you imagine future steps, right? So if China's thinking in terms of coercion, then maybe India accomplished its goal, they send a message, China might back off a little bit. If China's thinking in terms of sort of the importance of blocking, then the only lesson they learned is if you're going to build a road from A to B, make sure you already have troops at B, so they have to attack your troops, and they can't just put a blocking position there, and also any position in between, right? And also, wherever they don't have troops, you can still sort of move forward, right? You don't have to cross that line. It's just about sort of who can play out this game of advancing and inching forward without sort of crossing big red lines like using force. It's not about some sort of broader balance of resolve. That tends to be how I think about these situations. I'm more inclined to that view. Right, so if we go back to this sort of comparison and we break it down over time, what you see is kind of striking. What you see is that two of these are heavily clustered, right? So brute force, this is World War II. Interestingly, and this I did not expect, the coercion working, like actually acquiring territory, is heavily clustered in this unique international climate in the run-up to World War II. Right, the Sudetenland, Mamel, Bessarabia, Hatay, etc. Right, a lot of these are sort of obscure now, but it's remarkably ineffective after that. Right, and even when you look at cases where coercion might have worked without explicit threats, it's still hard to find them. Right, Hong Kong, that sort of thing. It's hard to find a lot of that stuff. In contrast, the fait accompli has been sort of this fairly steady part of international politics. So when I say it's becoming more important, it's not so much that it's becoming more common, it's that other things are becoming less common while it's persisting. Right? If you look after 45, it's even more striking, as we often do in the field. It's really quite lopsided. You also see within sort of territorial seizures, you see states becoming more cautious and moving towards modes of seizure that have a lower risk of war, that are more in line with the fait accompli strategy. Right, so you see up until around the end of the Cold War, seizing garrisoned or defended territories is more common, but lately seizing undefended, empty territories we don't have to shoot has become more common. Right, Crimea being an exception to that, although kind of an interesting one since they didn't end up shooting. Right, similarly, you see islands and places where the border wasn't drawn clearly now account for a really huge fraction of territorial seizures. These, and I won't get into the sort of research behind this, but tend to be places where the risk of war is lower. Right, this is particularly relevant to sort of China, both with respect to India and with respect to the islands. Right, whereas what I'll call core territory, sort of core unambiguous homeland territory, which is a higher risk of war, is less common. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested in. Do these small little territorial seizures matter? I sure think they do. Right, the two most violent confrontations we've ever had between nuclear powers, where they're actually shooting at each other, were both started by a sort of small territorial seizure in Kargil and the Sino-Soviet border war in '69. Right, and here's a list of, you know, Kargil, Badme, Snepa, the Falklands, right? Wars where one side thought it could get away with taking a small piece of territory and the other didn't. For whatever reason, these tend to be the wars that don't involve the United States, which is maybe why we don't focus on them, but that doesn't mean we have nothing to learn from them. Right, so just to wrap up with some conclusions for a few cases, if we're talking about maritime Asia, first point I'll make is I think a Chinese island grab, if you want to use that sort of term, should be scenario number one. I'm not saying it's the most dangerous scenario, and I'm not saying it's the most likely scenario, but I'm saying if you weight by both how likely it is and how dangerous it is, right, expected value, I think that probably should come out as number one, right? So for instance, I would view this as more likely than an ultimatum, and even if China were to try an ultimatum, I would expect that ultimatum to fail, and then they would have to decide whether to grab the island or not. Right, based on the sort of history of these past conflicts, and that's no guarantee, that's just what the general tendencies are. Right, as a bit of historical background, seizing islands has happened fairly often over the last 100 years around the world. Interestingly, it's led to war less than you would think. A lot of them lead to violence, but actually escalating all the way to a war rather than some sort of limited violence around just the islands themselves has been unusual. The Falklands are the one case that meets the normal 1,000 battle death academic definition of war, which you can have problems with quite reasonably. Another fact that I think is particularly interesting is that not once, as far as I know, in the last century, has a third party, so a friend or ally of the victim that's losing its island or its islands, fired a shot to defend the victim, right? So basically what this is saying is most countries, when they lose their islands historically, not only they haven't gone to war over it, but no one has come and helped them and intervened to fight for them. I think this sort of puts U.S. commitments in, say, the Spratlys or the Zenkakus in perspective, right? Even the broader history of conquest, it's normal to intervene when some country tries to take over another country, right? That affects the overall balance of power. Intervening to sort of defend their very small piece of territory that doesn't necessarily affect the overall balance of power, historically, allies just haven't been willing to do that, or friends. And that doesn't mean the U.S. couldn't or shouldn't do that in maritime Asia, but I think it's interesting to know just how sort of unprecedented it would be. It's really sort of realizing how rare this is, put in perspective what we sort of take for granted about U.S. alliance commitments right now. I'll say about Taiwan, I think the usual scenarios you see are invasion, blockade, and coercive bombing. I would add island grabs to that list, right? I think this is this doesn't offer China a path to winning overall on its sort of big picture goal with Taiwan, but it does offer them an easier path to a clean win, potentially. Right, Ituaba and the Spratlys, or Kinmen and Meizu, I would put those high on the list of likely scenarios, ones that don't necessarily get enough attention. I also think it's possible that, you know, if the most likely way you'd see a Chinese island grab is probably there's some provoking incident or event that provokes it, that evokes it, I should say. But the other, if it's more premeditated, the way that I would imagine them going about it, because I found that finding ways to do this without actually having to shoot at anyone is quite important, is waiting till the islands get some position gets evacuated due to weather and moving in afterwards. That would, I think, is something to worry about. And then I am out of time, or should I say a little bit about, okay. I'll say, this is my last slide, last substantive slide. I'll say a little bit about Eastern Europe, right? I think one thing, just because Russia has been more aggressive, I would say, than China over the last 5 years, it tends to obscure the fact that the sort of strategic opportunities for a fait accompli are actually a lot harder in Europe than they are in Asia, right? You don't have border ambiguities, you don't have islands, you don't have sort of these remote and sometimes unpopulated regions like we're dealing with in Asia, right? You're talking about sort of clearly drawn borders and important populated areas, part of sort of, for the most part, core homeland territories, right? It's sort of hard to move forward here. And as a result, we've seen Russia try to attack without attacking by denying that it's their forces attacking, right? The use of these sort of deniable forces are green men, right? This has been their solution to that. It's worked fairly well so far. What I think that's sort of missing is that actually the broader history of green men tactics is quite bad for the aggressor, right? My favorite case of this is Finland actually sent thousands of sort of green men into Russia, into East Karelia, to try to seize sort of ethnically Finnish parts of the region in 1919 during the Russian Civil War. They were crushed by the Red Army, and that's actually what's happened in the other cases like this, where deniable forces were sent not just to do anything, but to try to move an interstate border by seizing territory. There's a few other cases of this. Kargil is like this, arguably. And in each case, other than Russia's, the aggressor failed. And they failed because this tactic actually amounts to tying one hand behind your back, right? You're not fighting with your full military strength. You're only fighting with a force you can pretend isn't yours. That's going to not include air power, most likely. That's going to include only a small fraction of your forces, right? And so the answer to this, for the most part, has been to sort of accept the rules of that game and play it, and simply treat this as if, even though you know it's not, as if it's sort of a domestic opposition. You don't have to say that, but fight it accordingly, right? So basically, fight it as if it were a domestic threat, right? So what you want, if you're talking about, say, Estonia and the sort of Russian majority town of Narva, is you want Estonian troops to go in and be strong enough to deal with the threat themselves, right? Not NATO troops, and not sort of treating it as a Russian attack. Play Russia's game and win on those terms, and then leave Russia as the one that has to choose between escalating to a sort of higher risk, sort of open seizure of territory, at which point the NATO commitments come into play. Which again, I'm not sure is a line Russia would be willing to cross. So I'm actually more worried in the long run about the vulnerabilities to a fait accompli in Asia. And I think in Russia, and particularly in, say, the Baltic, the risk is actually lower than we might think. The circumstances are much less favorable to it. So that's it. In lieu of a usual conclusion slide, I'll just put up this chart that I'm quite attached to, and this one conclusion, that the fait accompli deserves more attention than it deserves. And I guess I can leave it at that.
Thanks, Dan, for a fantastic presentation. So we asked a couple colleagues and scholars in town who have different areas of specialization, but think a lot about strategy, to offer some reflections on the arguments, some applications, and also maybe identify some potential limitations of it. So we'd start with Olga Oliker.
Great. This works. So first of all, Dan, you've sold me on the fact that it's important to look at this concept of fait accompli in IR theory. I think it's also, aside from the theoretical contributions, I think it's a really important contribution to this very vague and poorly defined gray zone deterrence conversation we keep failing to have in a coherent way. I also have to admit that since my own wallet was stolen last week, I find it particularly, it really does hit me, though I will point out that when my wallet was stolen, there was no gun involved. It was simply taken from my bag while I was distracted, which raises what I think is an important question here, which is kind of where the use of force actually does and does not come in. Both the threat of force and whether or not you actually end up using any, either, and the extent to which the aggressor worries about the victim responding with force, right? I would argue that whoever lifted my wallet on the U-Bahn in Vienna last week was not, basically if I had turned around and seen them do it, they would have dropped the wallet, right? Which, again, it's a great metaphor because it does bring out a lot of these questions. It's the question of how much you want what you want. The other question that occurred to me when I was reading your work and also listening, and you alluded to this, and this is where the metaphor breaks down a bit, what's the goal? If it's a land grab, is the territory what you want? Or are you trying to do something else? And I think that is really an important thing to discuss. And I'm going to come back to it at the end of my comments. I'm going to talk about the Crimea case more specifically because I think this becomes very relevant here. I also can't help but wonder, to code it as a fait accompli, does it need to be intended that way? Does the aggressor, might the aggressor be ready to fight but just not have to? Is what the aggressor gets, are you conflating what they get with what they intended to get, right? If they end up with a small piece of territory but were hoping for more but backed off, it's this interesting question of what was the plan in the first place and how relevant is it? So I would also ask about kind of the real role of deterrence. You talked about this. And you talked about mostly in the South China Sea context, and it's the island context. But here, I think what's interesting is you can deter these things if you intend to deter them. It's much harder to deter them if you don't intend to, but you might end up doing it kind of by accident. But if you go back to Estonia and the Narva case, and I would argue that even if the Russians thought they could do a land grab in Estonia, they are very effectively deterred by it, by the existence of the NATO alliance, which they seem to believe in more than NATO these days. So, there are a land grab can be deterred, right? You threaten things credibly in response. Other things can be deterred. So, kind of the role that deterrence plays in this equation, the idea that a fait accompli is difficult to deter, I'm not sure is one that I fully buy. So, Crimea, and I mean, I think it's interesting because it does unpack some of this question. This is the case that starts the conversation. So, does this case work? And does this case do what you want it to do? So, my reading of Crimea is that Russia didn't actually go into Crimea with little green men with the intention of annexing the territory. Went into Crimea with little green men with the intent of coercing Ukraine. It did want to create a frozen conflict, most likely, which again, I'm not sure how you code frozen conflicts. None of the ones that I'm familiar with show up in your charts. So you seem to see it as a land grab if you actually claim the territory. If you just disrupt the territory and make a mess there, that's not what that is. So that could be a fait accompli. So I mean, I think that's. So when you're looking at the Crimea case, I don't think it was intended to be a land grab. It happened to turn out as a land grab. It happened to be an annexation, but the evidence of just that several-day period, including the Russian officials saying, no, we're not going to annex Crimea. Oh, look, we're going to annex Crimea. Look at that. It was always our plan to annex Crimea. I mean, I think that's important. I also think what's important is you don't code the Crimea case as having led to a war. I would, because I think what happens in Crimea is you have this tremendous unexpected success. You're trying to make a mess, and instead you end up with a peninsula. And then you think, oh, wow, if you're Vladimir Putin company, you think and people tell you this could work in other parts of this territory. They're going to welcome us with candy and flowers. Off we go into East Ukraine. And next thing you know, you've got a war by most definitions. You've got, you've got, the Ukrainians say they've got 4,000 combatants dead just on their side. So, that works as a war. And Without Crimea, you don't have East Ukraine, you don't have the war. And my guess is that the Russians were prepared for some fighting in Crimea, and then you get out, but instead you get something else. So again, kind of this question of unintended consequences, and in this particular case, which, not digging into the other cases, but I can't help but kind of ask the question, what does happen if you dig into the other cases, and what does that do for the theory? I'm going to stop because I don't want to use up too much of the time, and I want to have a broader discussion. Again, I think this is a really interesting contribution. I'm looking for ways to improve the model. I do think you're onto something here.
Josh?
Great. Well, thanks very much, Samir. Thank you to Stimson for organizing the conference, and thanks to Dan for the terrific paper and for your presentation today. Like Olga, I'm convinced it matters. We should pay attention to this. Fait accomplis, they happen a lot. They're a common part of international politics. They need more attention. And your presentation and your paper has also raised three bigger questions for me. The first one is, what happens next? What happens after the fait accompli? And Olga got at this as well. Now, if the fait accompli is meant just to seize a bit of territory for its own sake, then it's not very interesting for us. Right? It might be where the author of a fait accompli simply wants to seize a chunk of territory because it has intrinsic value, because it has symbolic importance, because it helps with domestic politics. Okay. That's not very important for international security. That's mostly a domestic affair. On the other hand, the author of a fait accompli might have more ambitions. Right? It might believe that it can seize new territory as a jumping off point, a way of projecting power more broadly. Or, interestingly, it might believe that a fait accompli can deliberately try to bait somebody into responding. Right? And this wasn't in your model, because you're interested in cases in which somebody does a fait accompli hoping not to have escalation, hoping not to. But in fact, there are cases in which you actually do a fait accompli in order to bait a third-party rival into a very bloody conflict. And there's a lot of attention to this in the classical strategic literature, not the political science literature that we're steeped in. But if you go back and read Clausewitz and Julian Corbett and the sort of old-fashioned strategists, they think about this a whole awful lot. Right? Corbett was most famous for thinking about ways in which you could plant yourself on a piece of territory and create the situation in which a third party would come in and sacrifice a whole lot of resources, right, blood and treasure, on your terms. Right? He was thinking back to cases like the Spanish ulcer during the Napoleonic Wars, the ability to turn Spain into a bleeding ground for Napoleon's forces. Right? And there are ways in which you can open up a secondary theater through a fait accompli in order to create this outcome. So from the perspective of the state launching a fait accompli, you can get a lot out of it. You can get domestic political gains. Maybe you can use it as a jumping off point for international expansion, or you can use it to bait your rivals into a contest on your own terms. The second question, what are the risks? Right? This actually could backfire in a bunch of ways. Right? Now, it might not lead to an unwanted war, and Dan's research shows this, but it can prove difficult to hold on to new territory. It's fun imagining ruling a new land until you actually have to rule that new land. Right? Governing is expensive, governing is a pain, governing raises all sorts of difficulties. It might also backfire domestically if you get involved in quelling local rebellions, right? or having to act in ways that are costly at home. And it might lead to catastrophe if a third party intervenes to try to push you out, right, but doesn't fight on your terms, or doesn't fight in the way that you expected. So earlier I mentioned the Spanish case, right, the Napoleonic case, as an example of a fait accompli working well, as being a way of drawing in French forces and bleeding them slowly and painfully. But there have been other examples which haven't worked at all. Like Japan's attempt to do this at the start of World War II. It's very clearly a fait accompli, occupying lots of territory, and then hoping that the US would stay out, that it would negotiate some settlement rather than trying to take all those territories back. Well, the US chose to take them back, right, in ways that were catastrophic to Japan. This leads to my last question. and probably most relevant for U.S. national security and U.S. foreign policy. When should the U.S. take the bait? Right? When do you push back? Right? Now, to come back to the Ukraine case, people that want the United States to push back and were really unhappy with the annexation of Crimea desperately want the U.S. to impose cost on Russia. Cost imposition is the watchword. We have to make Russia suffer for this. And this is the argument for sending lethal aid to Ukraine. On the other hand, people that oppose this, the doves say, let's not do that. Let's not get caught up in somebody else's civil war. Let's not throw our resources into a situation that we cannot control. So the question for U.S. policy is, who's going to control the interaction after the fait accompli, and who is going to impose more cost, right? The third-party intervener or the original author of the fait accompli, right? More fundamentally, what is, for the U.S., what is the risk of inaction, either in Ukraine or in the South China Sea or the other cases you discuss? If the fait accompli is a low-cost alternative and a relatively low-risk alternative to the authors, you're taking mostly unoccupied territories where borders are fuzzy, right? What's the importance for the United States of responding quickly, right? What if the United States does nothing, lets them happen? Are the implications really that significant for international security if the U.S. foreign policy response is low-key and basically ignores the problem? So those are just three questions. I've got a zillion others, but I'm sure you do too. So I'll leave it there, and thank you again for the terrific paper.
Fantastic, thank you.
So, Dan, we have a couple minutes. Would you like to offer some responses or reflections on the comments, or we can just jump into Q&A?
Yeah, I'm happy to try. I don't know that I can hit them all in a few minutes.
Why don't
so
you take a couple minutes?
Yeah, and I'll try to deal with yours quickly. So you had so many, I'll try to get to some of them. So what happens next after a fait accompli attempt? So I'm a little bit constrained here by the way I've operationalized it as a land grab, because there may be a few other things that are minority shares of those cases, especially what I've called the limited war cases that account for a disproportionate share of the wars. With that caveat aside, of like every time one country has gone and just taken a piece of territory much less than the full territory of another country in size, 70% of those don't end in war and 30% do. About half of them, they keep the territory, and that it's about a 50% of still holding it like after the resultant, kerfuffle is resolved, however long that takes, and it's still about 50% of holding it 10 years later. It's about 40% of holding it uninterrupted over those 10 years, meaning you didn't sort of lose it and then get it back by some other means, maybe a war. So those are sort of gives you a rough sense of outcomes. I think, so that would imply a 30% risk of war. I think the real number is closer to 10 or 20 because, like I said, I think there are those limited war cases in there where they actually knew they were starting a war. And you've mentioned the Japan case is a good example of this, right? Pearl Harbor, right? They know they're starting a war, but they're hoping it will be a limited war, and they're trying to get away with taking gains in a limited war to avoid a total war, which they end up failing to do, right? So that is, in a sense, a miscalculated fait accompli, but it doesn't quite fit my avoiding war. It's avoiding total war, right? It's a limited war fait accompli. It's its own flavor that you can think of as a fait accompli, but doesn't quite fit my definition perfectly. If you set those, sort of some of the Arab-Israeli wars are like that. If you set those aside, it's a pretty low rate of war, but not zero. And I gave some examples where it happened. The Falklands are a nice one. So those are just sort of the numbers. Your baiting a response question, I had not even thought about that. If you can give me some cases sort of post-1918 where you think that's happening, then I can start thinking about how to operationalize it and whether it sort of is a chunk of cases I've somehow been missing. I'm not under the impression that states, especially in the modern era, prefer to avoid fighting whenever they can and prefer to avoid escalation. And maybe that's a sort of a somewhat archaic strategy, but I don't know, maybe I'm just not thinking about it right. So if you can give me a few examples, I'd love to pursue that. When the U.S. should push back and should they push back in Ukraine, I think, as I said, talked about in Estonia, I think the most important thing in Ukraine is building up the Ukrainian military. I think what Ukraine can do is a lot more than what the United States can do. I'm skeptical of what the United States can do coercively with tools like sanctions, and in general skeptical of coercion, as you can tell. So I think the strengthening Ukraine's ability to, at the very least, stop Russia or Russia's sort of proxy deniable forces from taking new territory is the most important step. And similarly in Estonia, I care more about strengthening Estonian forces than stationing NATO troops there, although I do think the tripwire is useful. And I think very much in line with your comments, I am somewhat optimistic about deterrence working in the Baltic. Quite optimistic, actually, more so than I think the policy debates as it stands right now. I don't think, and I wasn't trying to argue, and here I'm transitioning into your questions, that the fait accompli always works or is always successful. I actually, what I find, and this is from another paper that I didn't present, is that trying to actually go into another country's core territory, which raises the issue, Josh, that you were raising about, like, well, if you let them take the first piece, then what about the next piece, and what about the next piece, right? That tends to be a very big deal, and even if that initial slice is small, if you've clearly crossed the border into their homeland, they're going to react in a big way because they can't sort of let that stand. But if it's some island off the coast that's separate, if it's some little place where the border wasn't drawn clearly in colonial times, that's a little bit different, and those are much more likely to work. And so actually, in general, it's hard to get away with the fait accompli, to get away with a land grab. But there are certain isolated geographic circumstances where it's more likely. Unpopulated territories, undefended territories, also sort of along those lines. Right? So about Crimea, why don't I address that? It doesn't have to, the annexation doesn't have to have been intended for my story to hold, but they do have needed to intend to sort of take control of the territory and have seen that as an important gain that was part of their objective. So whether they were going to formally annex it, to me, that's sort of a legality issue that's secondary, but were they trying to seize military, essentially conquest, right, not annexation, this is the distinction I'm playing with here. Were they trying to conquer the territory, if you want to use that word, and hold on to it, if you don't think they were trying to do that, then you can convince me of that, it will still be a land grab, but it won't be a good case. It won't be as good of a case of a fait accompli. But the annexation's not the issue. I think we're on the same page there. It's were they intending to sort of seize and to some extent hold control of it with their own forces is the issue. I don't think I did justice to even half your questions, but there's just too many for me to go through the rest, and I think I've exhausted my few minutes. So
Sure.
let's talk about it offline.
So Dan, in hearing this discussion, I want to push on one thread that I think I'm hearing because I think it backs into another really interesting set of arguments. So fait accomplis are a set of limited aim strategies that seem to be about some sort of incremental, small relative gains in terms of territory, right? And we're thinking about this in terms of territorial control. But it seems that you could also advance limited aims and improve relative gains against an adversary by, rather than seizing control of territory, undermining their ability to control it. Or undermining, let's say today, we think a little bit less about territorial control and more about just their ability to govern the Weberian state rather than the Westphalian state. And that seems to back you into a whole bunch of strategies which we see and observe but don't really think about in these terms, which is proxy strategies, right? The ability to back proxies through asymmetric means to undercut the ability of a state to operate within its own territory or its traditional sphere of influence. And so when Josh was talking about baiting strategies, we seem to be seeing one today, which it was described to me by somebody, Iran's strategy of backing the Houthis in Yemen may not have necessarily been about territorial control, but more about a bear trap for Saudi Arabia to undercut their sphere of influence in Yemen that they traditionally had, and then induce them to walk into a major war that can now, drain their resources and capabilities. So I just wonder whether this is a proximate idea, whether it's totally distinct, like sort of the necessity of this territorial control as sort of a central feature of it, or whether this is another way of advancing limited aims.
Yeah, so great question. I've used territory as a sort of an empirical domain within which to study the fait accompli, but it's not the only domain within which it applies. You're asking about another really big one. In fact, I looked at least superficially at every interstate crisis for the last 100 years. And what you find is I think territory is the number one issue area, and sort of support for rebels or meddling with rebellions and terrorist groups is number two. It's really important. It happens a lot. And what's interesting there, and I'll try to put this in simple terms, is I think what really matters is how good are your unilateral options, since it's really hard to coerce anyone to do anything, much harder than we recognize. And if you think about a support for rebel standoff, one side has a great unilateral option, which is just provide some money, provide some guns, right? It's really easy to do. It's really hard to stop unilaterally. Like you could try to bomb the gun shipments or something. It's really hard to stop that unilaterally. In contrast, the side that's providing the arms to the rebels is a really easy unilateral option. In contrast, the side that's trying to stop them, right? The side that's being victimized by the rebels has no good unilateral option. They have no good anything that looks like a fait accompli option. They're stuck with coercion, right? They can try to inflict punishment and dissuade the other side, and you know what? They usually fail. And I tend to think that which side has the better fait accompli option tends to be which side has a big advantage. And I think that's systematically in those conflicts because it's so asymmetric, unlike territorial conflicts, which are symmetrical, usually. That's why it's just such a hard problem to solve, and I'm not terribly optimistic about deterrence ever working too well against support for rebel groups or terrorist groups.
Great. Okay, so we've got let's start the Q&A, and I got some names down here. Let me just throw a few ground rules because I failed to do this in the beginning of discussion, but please keep your phones off. Should have told you that a while ago. Wait for the microphone to come to you, identify yourself, and then phrase your question, the formal question, as opposed to a statement. And we'll go Alex, and then Arzan, and then we'll come over here.
Hi there, Alexander Sullivan. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown. So I have a ton of questions, but my biggest one is, who does this? Have you sort of sliced and diced your cases of fait accompli based on, do democracies do it more or less than autocracies? Do great powers do it more or less than minor powers? Does the nuclear dimension play a role? If you could comment on sort of what the composition of the universe of cases looks like.
Yeah, the short answer to that question is yes. It's all over the world for the most part, and includes great powers and includes minor powers. There is the usual correlation of sort of states tend to compete, come into conflict with states at more similar power levels rather than more different power levels. But there's quite a mix of major powers all the way to small countries involved. Symmetrical dyads, asymmetrical dyads. There's a lot of democracies, non-democracies. There's not a lot of democracies versus democracies as long as you set polity to 8, not 7. There's just not a lot of nuclear cases, but there's nuclear states on both sides of this, and it doesn't seem like, I don't even view these cases, I think they're far enough often below the escalation level where nuclear weapons come into play that the nuclear factor is not necessarily important as anyone who studies nukes for a living would like you to think it is. So that's one of my more controversial views. Like I view Cargill as a territorial conflict first, as a nuclear conflict second, which is not the way the literature views it. So it's power level geographically. I guess the one big thing that jumps out is that so territorial grabs and conflict are disproportionately common in Europe before 45, disproportionately common outside of Europe after 45. No big shocker there. Crimea being an interesting exception to that. Some Greece, Turkey, Cyprus stuff also. Yeah.
Any other panelists have observations on?
And I can send you tables about that are in a paper that I'm going to post on my website soon. I have yeah.
So next we had Arzan, and then this gentleman over here after.
Arzan Tarapur, King's College London and RAND. I buy the empirical prevalence of fait accompli, but what I would like for you to clarify is the conceptual difference between fait accompli and what you call brute force. And what might clarify this distinction is some other people, like Lawrence Friedman, say the distinction is actually between coercion and control, right? And the key theoretical difference is whether you directly control the outcome or whether you rely on the other side to make a concession. So to play devil's advocate, why is it necessary to have this distinct concept that is distinct from control? What is it that this theoretically brings that control strategies and issues of direct control don't already tell us?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll take another look at that part of his work because I'm not used to talking about it in that language, so I appreciate that. I'd say the first thing when control comes to play, the first question that comes to mind is reversibility, right? And with brute force, you're destroying the other side, so it's not just that you take something, but it's effectively irreversible unless some third party is going to come in and save them or unless the strategy fails, right? But if you actually succeed with the strategy, like Iraq conquers Kuwait, Kuwait's gone, right? Whereas with the fait accompli, you're not doing that. This is why I put up, you're not disarming or disabling them. They're very much still there after you take something, and you're making a strategic gamble that they're not going to come back at you and either try to retake what you've taken or try to just punish you for it, right? As opposed to with brute force where they can't because you've disabled or destroyed them, right? So I think that's a critical, important distinction. As I said, this is the basic distinction with brute force comes back to brute force is about you win a war and then you take something big, right, in that order. Fait accompli is you take something small and then you don't fight a war if the strategy goes well, right? So in both of those respects, it's different. It's also different in the order. It's different on this issue of how reversible is it and what's the strategic logic of that. I think there's clear and important differences there. But I'm happy. I'll take another look at Friedman's work and think about it again.
Just one quick follow-on. I'm glad you mentioned Friedman and the way he looks at this. Friedman comes out of the strategic studies school, not the political science school, and I think this is a case in which more attention to the strategic theoretical literature is useful. Friedman defines the difference between coercion and control. You can go back to Clausewitz, who makes a distinction between limited and unlimited wars. And Clausewitz explicitly says that a limited war is just to slice off a piece of territory with no other ambitions, and something that you can do relatively quickly and at low cost. But an unlimited war sounds a lot more like what you're talking about with brute force. It's a war of conquest. It's a war of regime change. You're going to win by concentrating fire on target. It's not to make a grand point, just to say that this might be a way of helping tie this together theoretically.
If I can jump in too, I mean, I feel like part of it is whether the other guy fights back, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that your aggressor doesn't control, right? That's just their hope.
Yes.
So your variables get mushy here, right? Because your dependent variable and your independent, is it a fait accompli? Is that an independent variable or a dependent variable, right?
So this goes back to your question about intent, and yes, it is about intent, and sometimes the intent goes awry, right, in the outcome, and so in part of my research that isn't in the paper you read, I look at outcomes, right, and treat it as a variable, right? So you try to go in and get away with taking a piece of territory, and then what happens? And it ranges from they do nothing and you keep it to they kick you out and then invade your country and remove your regime, right? And that full range of outcomes are in there.
Or you've got, the Ukraine case is very interesting, right? You get cocky and you do something stupider and, that backfires. So your initial action was fine. It was your secondary action that was a problem.
No, that's absolutely. And just very quickly to follow up on Josh's point, I do think it's really important not to conflate so I agree with brute force and total war, but it's very important not to conflate limited war and the fait accompli. Like the fait accompli is mostly and usually about getting away with the gain while avoiding a war, even a limited war, right? You don't want to fight really at all. Sometimes there's, and I think 30% of the cases there's no gun, like no one's killed. Crimea arguably falling into that category. And Doklam falling into that category, right? Several of these cases that we care about falling into that category. And in others, the casualty toll is very low. So this is not just the sort of Mearsheimer limited aims or the Clausewitz you were invoking story of limited war. This is something that they didn't study because it wasn't war at all, and so it just wasn't part of their studies. But that 70% of cases that don't end in war, right? That's a lot of what I'm trying to talk about here. I don't think you can understand just by focusing on the subset of that 30% that are the limited war. Anyway, this is a sore point of mine, but the fait accompli is not the same as limited war.
I'll just make a little plug that Josh has a really great article that's quite useful, sort of identifying how strategic studies and security studies think differently about a lot of these security problems, often because these are sort of different schools of thought that don't interact, and more of that would be helpful for sort of bridging some of these problems. Okay, this gentleman over here.
Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. A couple of great examples. We had a land grab in Kirkuk this week. A very good example of fait accompli. And we have Korea grabbing Dokdo Takashima.
That's in there.
That's fascinating because as in Kirkuk, those are both U.S. allies. The most interesting example is Minami Torishima, a Japanese island, where the enemy was sea level. That is, if you could pour enough concrete on it to get it above sea level for enough hours of the day, you then get to grab it. And the huge circle of EEZ around it. My question is, this analysis is both brilliant and fascinating, but is it useful? If there's 200 ships full of concrete from the Chinese coast headed to Senkaku Islands tomorrow morning, and they will have completed their mission 2 weeks hence, what does this analysis do for us in the way of prevention or barking loud enough that they don't send the 200 ships full of concrete?
Yeah, it's no, that's a tough question and a good question. One thing, and it's too late on this point, but if Japan had at a point when it would have been less costly, station a garrison there that was there now, they'd be in a much stronger position to deter that. I do believe in tripwires. It's now doing that would be very politically sensitive, and I'm not advising that. But if they had anticipated the problem, sort of like if the Allies had anticipated what West Berlin would do to Cold War relations, they should never have created it, right? Well, this was a problem that could have been solved once, and hopefully having the theoretical framework will help that the next time there's the Senkaku Islands 30 years in advance, you'll see that coming and take that opportunity. So that's one. I guess one. Assuming the Chinese are going to be able to land there by surprise first, right? They're basically taking advantage of the fact that the islands aren't garrisoned, unlike the Spratlys, to put Japan in a very difficult position. So it would be Japan that has to shoot first to take them back. There's not a really good solution to that. There are a number of cases of taking back islands. Most of them don't lead to war, actually. Again, though, those aren't Japan versus China, right? Those tend to be smaller countries. So that's a big risk for Japan to run over such small islands. The one thing that there is a precedent for that I'll invoke this is from an interesting example from a tiny island that was disputed between Greece and Turkey in the mid-90s, Imia, or in Turkey, Kardok. So there's a whole brouhaha in the media. A ship crashes there. It becomes a big deal. Eventually, civilians plant flags, and then the Greek Marines come in and set up shop on the island, right? So now Turkey's in a tough position, right? And they come fairly near to exchanging blows over this. And what do? What they end up doing is going in and seizing a different island nearby that was left unoccupied, and then staring each other down from those positions until they both agree to withdraw. So if China were to only occupy the biggest island or the few biggest islands of the Senkakus, there might be an option for Japan that is at least better than doing nothing and looking like a complete failure, which would be to go in and take those smaller islands and at least save some face that way and have some of a position and hopefully try to sort of negotiate from that basis. If China leaves that option open, that would probably be my advice, because I'm somewhat skeptical that these islands are really usually worth a war.
That's a great answer, because it means that State Department policy planning staff should be doing a global study of vulnerabilities and catalog them and maybe come up with anticipatory responses.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Did we have any other thoughts on disruption or prevention of fait accompli? All right. Ali?
Hi, Ali Wine with the RAND Corporation. I wanted to follow up on your question and particularly in the South China Sea case, ask a little bit more about how you might operationalize deterrence against fait accomplis. And in particular, I want to tease out a little bit the temporal dimension. It seems that what makes it so difficult to deter Chinese behavior is that, in the past, I think like a few years, China has reclaimed something like over 3,000 acres in the South China Sea, but it didn't do so all in one fell swoop. It did so very, very incrementally. And so if China were to have reclaimed 3,200 acres of land in the South China Sea in one fell swoop, I think that might have raised a lot of alarm bells, and the United States might have said we need to intervene dramatically. But if you look at any given action, the sum of which led to those 3,200 acres, I think it would have been very difficult to make the case here at home that a seemingly innocuous, inconsequential land grab of 1 acre here, 2 acres there should elicit a strong response. So when it's not just a fait accompli, but it's a fait accompli that consists of very, very seemingly inconsequential accumulated steps, it's like a piecemeal strategy. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about the piecemeal temporal dimension of it a little bit.
Yeah, so this is, Schelling calls this salami tactics, right? That's the best literature on this, the best term for it. And I absolutely think that where you don't have sort of one bright line, like there are certain bright lines that make salami tactics hard, right? Like shooting. The first time you shoot at my soldiers, right, that's a big deal, right? The first time you cross sort of a well-defined international border, that's a big deal. But with land reclamation, there's nothing like that, right? And it's much more of a step-by-step, dribs and drabs kind of a thing, where salami slicing is much easier because there's no sort of bright red line there. And I absolutely believe that can work. This is why, for instance, I believe the United States could do more to sort of help arm Ukraine by doing it quietly and through third parties in all sorts of sneaky ways and little dribs and drabs, and it would be almost impossible for Russia to deter it. Not sure that would score the political victory that some people would like to in the press by doing it that way, but it could be done that way. I would sell arms to Taiwan that way instead of in big arms packages to reduce the Chinese ability to exert pressure on it. As another example. So I'm all for salami slicing. It's something I've written about in some of my other work. I think it's much more possible under some circumstances than others. Yeah.
I'd like to, a quick response. It's an interesting question. When we think about salami slicing, dribs and drabs, choose your metaphor, we always think about it in terms of the benefit for the person cutting the salami up, right? I'm getting a little bit more and you're not stopping me, and pretty soon I'm going to have the whole salami and a stomach ache. The problem is that when you...
The stomach ache.
The problem is the stomach ache, because the more little salami pieces that you take off, you have the problem of what to do with these things. So take the islands case in the South China Sea, right? I could make an argument that China has been very clever and subtle about this, drawing this out over time, right? Increasing fears about the solidity of alliances, the U.S. and its long-term allies. On the other hand, from an operational perspective, if I was in the U.S. Air Force or the U.S. Navy, I say I could attack those targets, right? Those reefs are fixed targets in space. They are incredibly vulnerable, right? This is a risk for China to take these new acquisitions. Simply holding territory doesn't necessarily mean you gain a strategic advantage over your main rival. It actually might create some pretty significant strategic risks. So from the perspective of US policy, one way you could look at this is, well, how do we deter these? How do we catalog all of the places that might become the target of a fait accompli before it happens? Or you might think, which places are not that bad if the other side takes them because they become vulnerable?
And I would also, on the deterrence point, one of the things that frustrates me about the broader gray zone conversation and the conversation about China and the South China Sea is this notion that it is America's job to deter everything, which is, as an American taxpayer, something I'm not terribly thrilled with. I think that what is necessary, highly unlikely to happen at any time in the foreseeable future, but necessary, is a prioritization of U.S. interests, right? It's not even that my adversary is going to get a stomach ache, it's that I don't care. The salami you're slicing is not my salami. It's, just, y'all figure it out, and I'm going to eat my bratwurst over here. And I think we don't do enough of that. And I think that's this notion that if it happens, the United States failed to deter it is nuts. Often things happen because the United States paid no attention to them for excellent reasons. Mm-hmm. And, we can't and we shouldn't. I can't not respond to an arming Ukraine conversation. The Russians have made very clear what their red line is in terms of arming Ukraine, and it's what gets termed lethal aid. By lethal aid, we mean things that actually blow people up or can cause harm to an adversary. That's not actually what the Ukrainian armed forces need. So, there's a tremendous win-win here. You can respect Russia's red line and not make a mess of it, and give the Ukrainians what they actually need, which is radios, armored vehicles to evacuate wounded, counter-battery mortars, things that they've, if you go and you talk to people on the front lines in Ukraine, that's what they're going to tell you they need. If you talk to people in Kiev, they're going to say Javelin. If you talk to people in Kramatorsk, they're going to say radios. Mm-hmm. Now, we're providing, and by we, I mean United States, NATO, all of that, providing most of that stuff. We're providing it in dribs and drabs. It gets there very, very slowly, and it's not always compatible with one another. So a huge part of this problem is that our aid provision system, by us, again, I mean the Western community, is not very well set up to do these things. I mean, this war's been going on for 4 years. This also brings up an issue with Javelin, with lethal aid, that if the decision was made to provide it, it would take a while to get there, a while to train people up on it. So you've got all the escalatory dangers, you've crossed Russia's red line, and you haven't actually provided the capability that they're so angry about, and it gives them this window to escalate, which I think is really dangerous. And beyond that, I do worry still about Ukrainian chain of custody, which also means that you provide them with something, and who knows where it's going to go.
So I've always wondered why salami slicing is the preferred nomenclature. I guess I was thinking about it, if you have a really good meat slicer, then you get the very thin slices of meat. But it's interesting to note that a more successful case of obstructing salami slicing tactics happened by a bunch of people who were probably vegetarians in Doklam. And Arzan has written an article about this, that the recent case of Doklam seemed to be a case where whether it's because of the reputation the Chinese had developed for salami slicing tactics, or because it was just conspicuous road building, the Indians moved very quickly to disrupt Chinese road construction, even though it was plausibly benign or plausibly for transportation purposes. And they did it, as Dan suggested, by doing so, on the same sort of level without escalating. They might have been able to sort of use other sort of tactics that they had other justifications for being there that might have given them plausible reason. But it does seem that there are ways to obstruct it when you start to see the accumulation slowly picking up over time. I don't know if that's an accurate sort of interpretation of your argument, but.
Yeah, so I would point to the period. I think people remember the '62 war, and they don't fully remember the months and months of strategic interaction between India and China leading up to it, where there's this bizarre game of like Taylor Frey, I'm getting this from Taylor Frable's book if you want to look it up yourselves, but it's this bizarre game where each side is sort of building posts, and then India has its forward policy of building posts in disputed territory, and they're building posts, sort of cutting supply lines to Chinese posts and overlooking Chinese posts, and then China is countering that by building more posts of their own. And there's months of this game of post building by both sides in disputed regions that finally blows up into the war, but for a long time stays nonviolent. And that's sort of where this could go if things get worse. You said India you seem more optimistic about how well India's done at stopping them. They stopped them in one specific place in a way that I'm not sure will translate anywhere else, and that China could offset just by using better tactics, even under similar circumstances the next time, basically moving troops forward to where the road's going to end, as I said during the talk. I think they want a very temporary victory.
I think I was
somewhat more
trying to
skeptical that they want long-term.
the identification problem that Ali's talking about, which is how do you know the incrementalism is actually sort of part of the strategic plan. They at least seem to believe this was part of it. It may not have been. All right, so the gentleman back there.
In South China Sea, other countries did the same thing like China.
Sorry, could you identify yourself?
Okay, Song, Fudan University.
Got it.
Okay. In South China Sea, other countries did the same thing like China, building island and make the island more military. But why United States only pay much attention to for China? By the way, most countries agree that Taiwan is a part of China. Do you think Taiwan is the same like Crimea? Thank you.
I think there are a lot of differences between Taiwan and Crimea. And yeah, there has been some land reclamation by other states before China. It was on a much smaller scale, but it happened. I don't know the details of it inside and out. And it's fair to ask if there's been some hypocrisy there. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from in all of those remarks, and I'll just inclined to leave it at that.
Anybody else want to jump in on this? All right. I want to make sure no one else wants to go in here before Alex gets a second shot, but we'll go ahead, Alex.
So my question is.
Why don't you just wait for the mic? Sorry.
Yes. Sorry, Alex Sullivan, Georgetown again. So it seems like one question that we've been dancing around a little bit is the issue of emboldenment after, or escalation of aims after a successful fait accompli. So to touch on the South China Sea, many people think that the successful fait accompli at Scarborough Shoal in 2012 was what convinced China that the United States did not treat this issue seriously enough to stop the subsequent salami tactics. A former classmate of yours, Mark Bell, has an interesting operationalization of emboldenment or escalation of goals after acquisition of nuclear weapons. Have you looked at this question empirically at all to sort of see whether aims, expand after a successful fait accompli?
Yeah, I've looked at a lot of crises and for different reasons, and for the most part, with the exception of maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you're really close to nuclear war, telling the difference between the nuclear and the non-nuclear crisis. The tactics, which is what I'm interested in, actually look quite similar, which surprised me. That wasn't what I expected to find, but it's hard to formalize that. But emboldenment, so territorial salami slicing. There are some cases of it. The Spratly Islands are a good one. It's not that common. I think partly it's because, as I said, most land grabs tend to be limited to these sort of unique peripheral areas, and there just aren't, by their nature, a lot of them. That's sort of why they're vulnerable, right? If there were a lot of them, then the salami slicing concern with stepping in after the first one would be bigger. And when that salami slicing concern is there, then the first one becomes a big deal, and there's a disproportionately big fight about it. I think at least in the territorial issue area, I don't know that I see a lot of emboldenment. And you might think, like, there just isn't. You can imagine a lot of ways in which a fait accompli or a land grab would be instrumental to something else, but I just don't see a lot. I mean, there's only one case that I'm aware of where a state grabs a small piece of territory to sort of convey that they're serious and then coerce another state into handing over a bigger piece of territory, right? There is one case of that. It's in the 1920s, and it's Turkey against Britain, and let's not get into it. But, like, that could happen more, but it just doesn't, right? Like,
But Dan, if I'm understanding the question, it's not so much you're trying to demonstrate your own resolve by doing a fait accompli, you're trying to test the other side's resolve. How much do you care about this? Does that fit into your framework?
I mean, I don't see that many iterated land grabs in the data. There are some. I'm not saying there are none. We probably just talked about the two best examples.
It's just not a common motive.
No, I don't think so. And
it is Crimea.
It's also, well.
It's Crimea followed by East Ukraine. I mean,
Yeah.
it's emboldenment, absolutely. So,
Okay.
you know, I mean, not having looked at your other cases in detail.
Well, that's true.
Happen.
Mhm.
I mean, to me, it seems interesting to wonder. Sorry. To me, it seems interesting to wonder. Obviously, it does happen. You've acknowledged that. But if it's rare, why is that? Because so much of why seemingly inconsequential news items get talked up a lot in policy debate is because of this idea of emboldenment, and where does it stop? And so with due deference to the idea that East Ukraine and the Spratly Islands that we've seen in the last few years are maybe examples of emboldenment, it's worth wondering why is that less rare, and what are the actions in equilibrium that make emboldenment not more common?
Well, but I think one of the kind of variables you're going to want to look at if you're going to try to parse that is your intention. Why did you do the land grab or whatever your fait accompli was? Because that might help you figure out whether you're going to be emboldened or not, right? If you are trying to test the adversary's resolve, then you probably are going to keep testing their resolve until you, as Lennon put it, hit steel, right? If you're trying to grab some territory because you want a military base, then once you've got your military base, you're good.
So just one problem analytically with this is that just about any action you take, and including doing nothing, can be interpreted easily as a signal of something, right? A signal of resolve, a signal of benign intentions, a signal of some balance between the two, a signal of whatever, right? And similarly, like any hostile action you take can be interpreted as a probe or a test of resolve, literally any, and it's almost non-falsifiable to say. And so I think that lends to what I see as an overemphasis of that perspective, that coercion, resolve, signaling perspective, and an underemphasis on it's more just a question of what can you get away with taking, often for other reasons, unilaterally by fait accompli. But it's very difficult to prove that empirically because, as I said, the alternative explanation is virtually infinitely malleable. So I do agree that there are cases of it. This isn't ever, rarely is this a question of deterministic causation or all and never. This is a question of more versus less common.
Just a point of clarification, Dan. So the data set you presented today is successful territorial acquisitions.
So there's actually no
seizures.
neat divide between success and failure, right?
Okay.
The success means like you called it, were able to take it. Does it mean you took it and held it after that sort of crisis or dispute ends?
Yeah.
Does it mean if it started a war, that you won that war? Or does it mean you hold it 10 years later? Does it mean
Well, I
you
guess I'm
held it
wondering-
uninterrupted for 10 years, 50
Yeah.
years later? Like it's actually, so I have different ways
But
of
the point
looking
is,
at
though, that it will only be observable if there is some degree of success. I guess the question is, are we selecting out maybe thousands of attempted fait accomplis that were failed?
No,
Okay.
not. I don't. So in other issue areas maybe, but with territory, the thing about these small territories is that first of all, you only need to take like a tiny piece to enter my data set, and second of all, like you have the initiative, you have the element of surprise. Like usually they're just not heavily built up right in that one place. So the number of cases where a state tries to take a small piece of territory and gets so coldly stopped that they don't get any of it is almost zero. And they're mostly retaliatory fait accompli attempts, which are actually fairly common. So like they take it and you try to take it right back, right? So there are a few of those. But like other than that, because you have the initiative, because they may not even have troops there or they're not expecting it, right? The element of surprise is important. And you can easily mobilize. These are small regions for the most part. You can mobilize 10, 100 times the troops in that area. Like it's much more than the normal 3-to-1 ratio, if they even have troops at all. So I don't think that's very common. With the attempts to take over whole country cases, I do include the cases where you only got part of it, but you're trying to take all of it in that category, like the Korean War. So I do have to look at intentions for that, but it's not that hard.
All right, we got time for one more question. See James in the back. Wait for the mic.
James Stevens with the Stimson Center. So to your last point,
to what extent have you contextualized some of these grabs in the context of a larger campaign that may be taking place? Because, like you say, these represent, in many cases, incursions by hostile forces where there are no defending forces to counter them. So I wonder, to what extent is it just brute force applied in the absence of defensive forces?
Yeah, so I do think you can, like I said, about half the time I get questions about the fait accompli conceptually. It's, well, isn't it brute force because it's sort of unilateral imposition, something along that lines. The other half is, isn't it coercion because you still need to deter them from coming back at you? We accept that those two things are fundamentally different. That's kind of interesting. Right? It kind of suggests to me that it really is some third thing that's sort of in between the two. So conceptually, that's how I think about it. And yeah, it's so one thing I should have made clear from to answer the data part of your question is that, so within any like crisis or dispute, if you like say like take 5 islands, that's only one case for me. That's not 5 cases because you took 5 islands, even if you took 2 on day 1 and 3 the next week or something like that, right? But if they're years apart, they're going to be separate cases. So that alone cuts down on the like double counting problem. So even the case I mentioned with the sort of sequential post building in disputed territory, that's one of the most salami slicing-esque cases in the entire 100 years I've looked at. Like that's still just one case, or actually 2 cases, one by India, one by China. In the data, so that cuts down on it a lot. But so I haven't looked in great detail at how those cases are different, or how much it matters when there are sort of cases every decade or 2 versus just one ever. I haven't done a lot with that yet, and hopefully I will, or somebody will at some point. It's a good question.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. This is a South Asia program event that's actually ending on time, so count yourself lucky. And thanks for all for joining us here and online. To Dan, to Olga, to Josh for great presentation and comments. And for those of you who found your way here because of Twitter or like social media posts, please feel free to sign up for our mailing list for future events, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks.